Mr.ShroomCaster.
10 years ago, my life was completely different. I was young, 22 years old, just starting to make plans for the future. I worked at this small cafe and took the last bus home every night. I was a bit careless, like most people my age. Back then, I thought life was just beginning and all the serious problems were still far off. But one night, everything changed. It was July, a warm summer evening, nothing unusual about it. I stayed late at work because my manager needed help closing the register. By the time I finally left, it was almost 11 p.m. The city sky was cloudy, though there wasn't any rain yet. I decided to take a shortcut home, through the alley. This alley was narrow, with a few old streetlights that barely lit the path. Even patrol cops didn't check it often. But I'd walked through it plenty of times and never thought anything could happen. I was halfway through when I heard voices. At first, it was just murmuring, but then it turned into shouting. Just a few feet ahead, two men were arguing. One of them, taller and heavier, had the other guy by the collar, shoving him against a wall. Their fight looked like it was reaching a breaking point. I froze, deciding to wait, not wanting to get involved. Then I heard the shot. Everything happened in a second. I saw one of the men drop to the ground. The shooter didn't stop for a moment. He turned around and ran in the direction I'd just come from. As he passed me, I saw everything. His dark jacket, his short cropped hair, and the intense focus on his face. My mind felt like it had hit pause. I stood there in the alley for a few more minutes, staring at the body lying on the ground. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard across the block. But I didn't do anything. Fear completely paralyzed me. I was terrified he might come back. What if he saw me? And what if the police found out I'd been there? I didn't want any trouble. I went home, trying to erase everything I'd seen from my mind. This isn't my problem, I kept telling myself. Maybe someone else saw it. Maybe someone else would call the cops. I decided I wouldn't say anything. The next day, the headlines were everywhere. Suspect arrested in murder case. The police claimed they'd caught the killer quickly, and the case was practically solved. I didn't pay much attention to it until I saw the photo of the guy they arrested. It wasn't him. The man in the mugshot looked nothing like the shooter. He was shorter, thinner, and had a completely different face. That was the first time I felt guilt hit me like a punch to the gut. The news said the man denied being involved in the murder and claimed he was on the other side of town when it happened. But the police said they had evidence, and they painted him as a dangerous and suspicious person. I knew I could have changed everything. I could have gone to the police and told them who I really saw, but I didn't. I kept telling myself it wasn't my responsibility, that it was too late to do anything now. So I stayed silent. The man who got arrested, Marcus Lane, kept insisting there was a witness who could prove his innocence. He even said it in court. I heard about it, but I stayed quiet. With every passing day, the weight of my silence got heavier. Months went by after that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something terrible. At first, I convinced myself it was temporary, that it wouldn't really affect me. But the more I tried to push that night out of my head, the more it crept back in. The man they arrested was named Marcus Lane. I found that out by chance, listening to the news on the radio one morning. He'd been sentenced to 20 years for the murder, and the way they reported it, it was so casual, like it was just another story. I remember sitting in my apartment, drinking some cheap coffee, when I heard it. My hand froze mid-air, the cup still in my grip. The words hit me like a bolt of lightning. 20 years of a man's life I could have saved. Those words stuck with me. They echoed in my mind every time I walked to work or made my way home. Sometimes, I'd stop in that same alley and just stare at the pavement where it all happened. It was so quiet there. The weak glow of the streetlights, the emptiness. Nothing had changed, except me. Every night, as I lay in bed, I replayed it over and over. I saw the killer's face, his cold expression as he ran past me. And then I saw Marcus's face in the mugshot, sitting in prison for something he didn't do. I imagined his fear, his anger, his desperation. I thought about his family, the pain they must be feeling. One day, on my way back from the store, I stumbled across a protest. A group of people were standing on the sidewalk holding signs that read, "Free the innocent," and "The system got it wrong." My chest tightened, and it felt like my heart was being squeezed. I wanted to scream at them, tell them they were right, that I saw everything with my own eyes. But I didn't. I just kept walking, my head down, avoiding their stares. My work started to suffer. I was constantly distracted, snapping at people over little things. My coworkers joked that I was burning out. They didn't know the truth. One night, my boss pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was just tired. The worst moment came when I saw an interview with Marcus's mom. She was sitting in front of the camera, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She talked about how her son had always been an honest man, how she believed with all her heart that he was innocent. Then she said the words that shattered me. If only the witness would come forward. That person could save my son. Her voice echoed in my head for days. Every time I looked in the mirror, I didn't see myself anymore. I saw a coward, a man who betrayed his own humanity. I started avoiding my friends because I was convinced they could see it too. I stopped going to places where I might run into someone I knew. One day, I tried to write an anonymous letter to Marcus's lawyer. I sat down with a notebook, pen in hand, and stared at the blank page. I wanted to tell them everything. What the killer looked like, how he ran, the direction he went. But the words wouldn't come. What can I even say? That I stayed silent all this time? Will they even believe me? The letter ended up crumpled in the trash. I thought silence was the easy choice, but I didn't realize how much it had started to destroy me from the inside out. Back then, I didn't understand that this was only the beginning. 3 years had passed since that night, but I couldn't say my life was moving forward. It was like everything had frozen in place. Every day was the same. Wake up, go to work, sit in the office, come home, eat dinner, go to bed. Over and over. I used to dream about traveling, achieving new goals, becoming successful. But now, every decision I made came down to one thing: staying invisible. I couldn't let anyone figure out that I was carrying a secret that was eating me alive. Back then, I thought silence was the easiest choice. But as the years went by, it started to feel heavier and heavier. At first, I managed to pretend nothing had happened. But then, one day, I heard the name Marcus Lane in the news. Marcus had already been in prison for 3 years. 3 years for something he didn't do. I knew it, because I had seen the real killer with my own eyes. But now my silence wasn't just a personal burden. It had become part of the reason Marcus was sitting in a cell. I felt like an accomplice to a crime, even though I'd never pulled the trigger. I stumbled across his story by accident. One night after work, I was sitting on my couch, mindlessly scrolling through the news on my phone. That's when I saw the headline, "Lawyer Files Motion to Reopen Marcus Lane Case." The article wasn't long, just a few short paragraphs, but they hit me like a brick wall. It said Marcus's lawyer was arguing that he'd been convicted based on false evidence. He had an alibi the night of the murder, but the police ignored it. I read to the end of the article, and then I saw the line that made my stomach drop. If even one witness had spoken up in his defense, it could have changed everything. That was the truth. That witness could have been me. I tossed my phone onto the couch and stood up, shaking. My hands were trembling, my heart pounding. It was like everything I had been trying to suppress for years was finally clawing its way to the surface. I started looking up more about Marcus. I learned he'd worked as a mechanic at a small repair shop. He was just a regular guy. Not rich, not powerful, just someone who didn't have the resources to defend himself properly. Then I found another article. This one was about his mother. She was sitting on an old couch in a tiny house, talking to reporters. Her face was lined with worry, and her voice carried a sadness that seemed endless. "My son was never a violent man," she said. "He has a good heart. I know he didn't do this. If only someone would come forward and prove it." Her words broke me. Imagine what it feels like to see someone literally begging for help and knowing you're the person who could give it. But instead of helping, you just sit there, doing nothing. I couldn't stop thinking about her. Her voice played on a loop in my head every night. Finally, one evening, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I grabbed a sheet of paper and a pen and started writing a letter to Marcus's lawyer. I wrote everything I remembered about that night. The killer's height, his clothes, the way he ran, even his haircut. I described every detail. The letter was nearly finished when panic set in. What if they find out I stayed silent for all these years? I thought. What if the police think I was involved? What if the real killer finds out I talked and comes after me? I stared at the letter, my chest tightening. Then I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. I sat there at my kitchen table, staring at that ball of paper, feeling like the worst person on the planet. The next day, I was walking down the street when I saw a protest. A group of people were holding signs, chanting, "Justice for Marcus Lane." One of the signs stopped me in my tracks. It said, "Where is the witness?" It felt like a punch to the gut. Those words might as well have had my name written on them. My legs almost gave out. For a second, I thought I was going to collapse right there on the sidewalk. But instead, I did what I always did. I walked away. I sped up, kept my head down, and pretended I didn't see them. My silence had become a sickness, eating me alive from the inside out. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror anymore. Every time I did, I saw fear, shame, and betrayal staring back at me. That was the moment I realized the silence I once thought was so simple had become my heaviest burden. When I finally realized I couldn't stay silent any longer, it didn't feel like a relief. It felt like jumping into freezing water, terrifying, but with no other choice. I knew I had to act. But the moment I decided to do something, every doubt and fear imaginable came crashing down on me. My first step was simple: find Marcus Lane's lawyer. I didn't know if I could say everything in person, so I decided to write another letter. This time, I forced myself to finish it. I wrote out everything I could remember from that night. What the killer looked like, the way he ran past me, every detail I had seen. I explained why I had stayed silent, how fear had taken over, and how deeply sorry I was. I signed it with a pseudonym, sealed it in an envelope, and carried it in my pocket. For 2 days, I couldn't bring myself to send it. The thoughts wouldn't stop haunting me. What if the police find me? What if the lawyer leaks this to the press, and everyone knows my name? Will people even understand why I kept quiet for so long? On the 3rd day, my hands trembling, I finally dropped the letter into a mailbox. As I walked away, I felt torn, like I'd taken a step forward but also lost control over what might happen next. A week passed, then another. There was no response. I started to think the letter had gotten lost, or worse, that the lawyer had ignored it. That's when I decided to take a bolder step. I found the number for the lawyer's office and called. When the secretary asked who I was, I froze. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Finally, I forced the words out. I'm a witness in Marcus Lane's case. It felt like my soul had left my body. Those were the first honest words I had spoken in years. The secretary put me on hold, and then I heard a calm but slightly tense voice on the other end. "Are you ready to make a statement?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I felt paralyzed. Finally, I gathered the courage to say, "Yes, I was there that night. I saw what happened, and I know Marcus is innocent." The lawyer asked me to meet in person, and I agreed. The meeting was scheduled for the next day. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, imagining every possible way it could go wrong. Would the lawyer judge me? Would they ask why I stayed silent for so long? But I knew I couldn't run from this anymore. The next day, I arrived at the lawyer's office. It was a small space with simple furniture and stacks of papers everywhere. The lawyer, a short woman with glasses, listened intently as I told her everything about that night. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You realize your silence may have cost Marcus years of his life?" I nodded. I had no words left to defend myself. She explained that to use my testimony, we would need to go to court. That meant I'd have to testify at a hearing, and my story would become public. The thought of it terrified me. But at the same time, I felt like this was my chance to make up for at least some of what I had done wrong. It took a few weeks for the lawyer to file the new motion. Those weeks were some of the hardest of my life. Every phone call, every email made my stomach drop. I was constantly on edge, terrified of what might come next. But deep down, I knew I was doing what I should have done years ago. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday. When the day came, my hands were shaking as I walked into the courthouse. In the hallway, I saw Marcus's mother. She looked just as tired as she did in the photos I'd seen in articles. I wanted to walk up to her, to apologize, to tell her how sorry I was. But I couldn't. At the hearing, I gave my testimony. I described that night in detail, what I saw, what I remembered. I explained why I had stayed silent for so long. When I finished, the room went silent. Marcus's mother started crying. The lawyer gave me a small nod, as if to say, "You did the right thing." I didn't know if it would be enough to free Marcus, but it was a start. It was the beginning of my attempt to make things right. My testimony was a turning point in Marcus Lane's case. For the first time in years, there was a chance to undo the mistake that had destroyed his life. But as his lawyer explained, this was only the beginning. Even with new evidence, getting a case reopened wasn't easy. The system doesn't like admitting it's wrong, she told me, and I believed her. The next 3 months were some of the hardest of my life. Every day felt like a test of my patience, my resolve, and my guilt. I couldn't stop thinking about how much damage my silence had already caused. At the same time, I felt exposed, like everyone around me somehow knew the truth. Every news segment about wrongful convictions made my stomach churn. Every time someone on the street glanced my way, I wondered if they could tell that I'd failed to act when it mattered most. Rationally, I knew that was impossible, but guilt doesn't care about logic. And then there was the waiting. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a spike of anxiety. Would this be the call where I finally learned what happened next? Did Marcus's future hang on the other end of the line? I couldn't stop checking the news for updates. I was desperate to hear that this nightmare, his nightmare, my nightmare, was over. Finally, one afternoon, my phone rang. It was Marcus's lawyer. Her voice was calm, but carried a tension that made me sit up straight. "We have good news," she said, a hint of relief slipping through her tone. "The court has agreed to review the case. We've secured a new investigation." I sank back into my chair, barely able to process her words. It was just the first step, but it was huge. For so long, the weight of what I'd done, or rather what I hadn't done, had felt immovable. Now, for the first time, it felt like it might shift. Over the next several months, I followed every development in the case obsessively. Every court filing, every statement, every hearing. I was glued to it all. The process was grueling, as Marcus's lawyer had warned it would be. The prosecution fought hard to protect the original conviction. But piece by piece, Marcus's innocence came to light. I remember the day the verdict changed. It had been 8 months since my testimony, and I was sitting at my desk at work, pretending to care about spreadsheets I couldn't focus on. When I saw the news alert on my phone, my breath caught. Marcus Lane exonerated after 8 years in prison. The words blurred on the screen as tears filled my eyes. I left my desk, rushed to the bathroom, and locked the door. I just stood there, staring at myself in the mirror, trying to absorb the reality of what had happened. He was free. The next morning, I saw it on TV. It was a bright, sunny day. Cameras were stationed outside the prison gates, recording every moment. Marcus walked out into the sunlight, his steps slow and measured. Waiting for him were his mother and sister. His mother was crying, clutching him tightly as if she would never let go. His sister stood beside them, wiping her own tears but smiling through it all. The look on Marcus's face was harder to read. There was relief, but also weariness, a weight he'd carried for too long. I sat in my living room, watching the screen, my chest tight. A lump formed in my throat, and I wiped at my eyes. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I had hoped for. And yet, along with the relief came a new fear. Now that Marcus was free, I would have to face him. A few weeks after his release, Marcus's lawyer called me again. She suggested that I meet with him. "It might help both of you," she said. At first, I resisted. How could I look him in the eye? How could I apologize for stealing years of his life? But eventually, I realized it wasn't about what I wanted. It was about what I owed him. We met in a small room that the lawyer had arranged for us. I arrived first, pacing nervously until the door opened. When Marcus walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. Prison had aged him in ways that no one should have to endure. His shoulders were broader, his face lined with exhaustion. But what struck me most were his eyes, calm, steady, and deeply serious. I sat down across from him, fumbling with my hands, unsure how to start. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I don't have any excuses. I should have spoken up back then, but I didn't. And because of that, you lost years of your life." He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, he said, "You could have stayed silent, but you didn't. Because of you, I'm free." I hadn't expected those words. My heart raced, my palms sweaty. Then he added, "I can't say I've forgiven you. Not yet. But I appreciate that you had the courage to take this step. It means something." After the meeting, I stepped outside into the cool air and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe fully. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Now, it's been 10 years since that night in the alley. I think about Marcus often. I think about his mother, about all the pain they endured because of me. My decision to stay silent didn't just ruin his life. It ruined mine too. But over the years, I've learned that even the biggest mistakes can teach you something. That night still haunts me. It probably always will. But I've stopped running from it. Instead, I carry it with me as a reminder of the price of inaction. Silence, I've learned, can sometimes be the loudest, most destructive thing of all.